For the longest time, the story of global development felt pretty straightforward. Wealthy nations in the North would give aid to poorer nations in the South. But that whole story, it's being completely torn up and rewritten. Today, we're going to dig into this huge shift in how countries help each other, and we're going to focus on one country in particular, Brazil, that really became a leader of this new way of thinking.
And this whole shift forces us to ask a really big question, one that gets right to the core of this entire debate. Is foreign aid a generous gift, or is it some kind of trap? It's something to keep in the back of your mind as we go through all of this.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the old system and why it just wasn't working for a lot of countries. Then, we'll dive into this new South-South model, using Brazil as our main guide to see how it works in the real world, where it's had some struggles and what it all means for the future. Okay, so to really get what's new, we've got to look back at the old way of doing things. Let's take a look at that traditional model of development aid that was dominant for most of the 20th century and ask the question right there on the slide. Who was this system really for?
Well, the pushback started way back in the 1960s with this really powerful idea called center-periphery theory. Basically, economists argued that the whole global economy was kind of rigged. Think of it like this. The periphery countries in the South were like the department that just digs up cheap raw materials. But the center countries in the North, they were the ones who took those materials, turned them into expensive products, and kept almost all the profit. So there was this growing feeling that the system was just unfair from the very beginning.
Now, to deal with this criticism, the wealthy nations made a big promise. They pledged to spend 0.7% of their national income on something called Official Development Assistance, or AOD. This promise was made way back in the 70s, and then they doubled down on it in 2002. This was supposed to be the financial glue holding the whole system together.
But, and this is a huge but, it was a promise they mostly didn't keep. To this day, you can count on one hand the number of industrialized countries that have actually hit that 0.7% target. And that gap between what was promised and what was actually delivered, it just created this deep sense of frustration. It really set the stage for something totally new.
So all that frustration, it didn't just disappear. It actually became the fuel for a radical new approach. Let's talk about the new model that grew out of it, South-South cooperation. This was a path forged by developing nations for developing nations. And you got to understand, this didn't just happen overnight. This was an idea that had been bubbling up for decades. It started with those challenging economic ideas back in the 60s. Then it got a political voice with the creation of UNCTAD in '64. And finally, it was made official in 1978 in Buenos Aires, which really laid the foundation for everything we call South-South cooperation today.
And when you put these two models side by side, the difference is just night and day. The old aid model, it was vertical. You had a donor looking down on a recipient. This new South-South model is horizontal. It's a partnership between equals. And while the old aid often came with all sorts of political strings attached, this new model is all about solidarity, mutual benefit, and a really strict policy of not interfering in each other's business.
All right, so that's the theory. But what does this actually look like when the rubber hits the road? For that, we're going to turn to our main case study, Brazil, which just became this absolute powerhouse of South-South cooperation in action.
Okay, the absolute first and most important thing you need to get about the Brazilian model is this simple fact. It is not about writing big checks. It was never about just handing over cash. No. Instead, it's all about sharing knowledge. Brazil's most valuable export in this whole thing wasn't money. It was their hard-won expertise. They had already faced so many of the same development problems that their partners were facing, so they were ready to share exactly what they'd learned. And this whole approach was built on a few really clear, really important principles. It had to be a partnership of equals, with zero political conditions. It had to be good for both sides. And this part is crucial. The projects were always demand-driven. They were based on what the partner country asked for, not what Brazil thought they needed. Plus, they were carried out by Brazil's own public experts, not a bunch of expensive outside consultants. So what does this actually look like in practice? Let's get into some amazing examples of this model in action, covering everything from high-tech satellites all the way down to social policy.
Basically, Brazil shared what it was already great at. They partnered with China on a really advanced satellite program. They shared game-changing agricultural tech from their agency, Embrapa, which helped totally transform farming in tropical climates. They exported public health knowledge from their world-class Fiocruz Institute, and they literally shared the blueprint for their social programs that helped lift millions of Brazilians out of poverty.
And it wasn't just Brazil going it alone. They teamed up with India and South Africa to create something called the IBUS Forum.
Their special fund finances these high-impact projects in other developing countries, and the philosophy is crystal clear from this quote. It operates without any conditions. This is just a world away from traditional institutions like the World Bank. And this is where you see the bigger picture starting to emerge. Brazil and its partners weren't just running a few projects here and there. They were building a whole new financial architecture. By helping to create institutions like the BRICS New Development Bank, they were literally building a parallel system to fund their own vision of development, totally separate from the old one.
But look, it wasn't all smooth sailing. This incredible growth created its own set of problems. We have to look at the internal struggles that came with such an ambitious model. In a lot of ways, Brazil's cooperation program became a victim of its own success.
And this is what they call the paradox of success. It's a classic case of being too popular. As Brazil's reputation as a great partner grew, the demand for its help, that's the first bar on the chart, it just went through the roof. But the agency in charge of coordinating everything, the ABC, it just didn't have the staff or the budget to keep up. So you had this massive gap between how much they wanted to do and what they could actually manage.
And you can see why it got so complicated. The very thing that made the cooperation so valuable, the fact that it drew on deep expertise from over 100 different government bodies, that was also its biggest weakness. Trying to coordinate all these different agencies, from agriculture to health to space technology, it was a constant, massive headache.
All right, so after all that, where does this leave us? In this last part, let's zoom out and think about what the shift really means for the future of global development. What's next?
Well, the big takeaway here is that the old, simple map of development just doesn't work anymore. We've moved from that clear, simple past into a much more complex, messy, and dynamic present. Now you've got all these different models, north-south, south-south, even something called triangular cooperation, all existing at the same time. Sometimes they work together, and sometimes they compete.
And that leaves us with a huge open question. As more and more powerful countries from the global south take their place on the world stage, is that going to lead to more cooperation to solve our biggest shared problems? Or is it just going to create more competition, with all these different ways of thinking clashing with each other? Honestly, nobody knows the answer yet. But one thing is for sure, the old rules of development are gone for good.